I inherited the land quietly, through a will that surprised everyone except the man who wrote it. He was my uncle, a private man who avoided neighbors, paperwork, and explanations. The acreage sat far from town, fenced uneven, and ignored by most people who passed it without stopping to look. When the attorney handed me the documents, he paused like he expected disbelief. 600 acres, undeveloped, inherited outright. No debts, no partners, no conditions. Just land. The kind people dismiss because it doesn't look impressive from the road. I nodded, signed, and said nothing. The quiet felt appropriate. Final. I visited the property alone the first time, early morning, with fog still hanging low. It stretched farther than I expected, rolling fields, scrub, and sections clearly untouched for decades. There were no signs, no branding, no effort to impress. Just space. Quiet. Potential. I understood why my uncle stayed. The HOA noticed it a month later, once survey markers appeared near the boundary. They sent a letter, polite but dismissive. The land, they said, had no development value. Too remote. Too irregular. They suggested I sell cheaply or leave it unused. Worthless. Appeared twice. I read it twice, carefully. I didn't respond immediately because nothing in the letter required urgency. They weren't threatening. They were dismissing. That bothered me more. I requested records, zoning history, and environmental reports. That request changed everything. The tone shifted. Emails shortened. Calls stopped. Then a patrol car showed up at the gate. Slowly. 2 officers stepped out wearing full hazmat suits, masks sealed, boots taped. They didn't approach the house. They flagged the perimeter and waited. I stood back, watching. No sirens. No urgency. Just procedure. When I asked, they said the land had been flagged for survey. They couldn't say more. Yet. The HOA president arrived minutes later, visibly annoyed by the scene. She told the officers the land was unused, worthless, and shouldn't require this level of response. One officer ignored her completely. The other asked for documentation. She didn't have it. That silence stretched longer than expected. I said nothing. They asked me when I inherited the acreage and whether I'd disturbed the soil. I answered honestly. No, not yet. A glance passed between them. One radioed in coordinates. The other told me to remain nearby. The word precaution floated without explanation. The HOA president stepped back. Her certainty faded. Neighbors gathered at a distance, phones out, whispering theories without facts. The officers marked points with flags. The land I was told was worthless now required protective equipment. I felt something shift. Not fear. Awareness. Whatever lay beneath that soil mattered. Enough to slow authority. Enough to change tone. Permanently. The HOA president tried again, insisting this was an overreaction. She mentioned property values, appearances, and future plans. The officer finally looked at her. He said the survey wasn't about aesthetics. It was about safety. That word landed hard. She stopped talking. I noticed her hands shaking. Slightly. Uncontrolled. Real. I saw nothing that day, but I learned something important watching them work. Land doesn't advertise its value. It hides it. Quietly. Patiently. My uncle hadn't left me nothing. He left me unanswered questions. The kind that make people uncomfortable. The kind that require suits, protocols, and silence. The kind that matter. As the officers packed up, one said the full assessment would take time. Weeks. Maybe longer. The HOA president left without speaking. The road felt longer after that. I locked the gate, looked back across the acres, and understood the irony. They called it worthless because they didn't understand it. The next few days were filled with quiet tension rather than answers. No official report arrived. No explanation followed the Hazmat visit. Just an unspoken shift in how people treated the land. The HOA stopped emailing entirely. Their earlier confidence evaporated, replaced by silence that felt deliberate rather than accidental. I drove out again, this time with a notebook, marking where the officers had placed their flags. They weren't random. The points followed a pattern, loosely tracing an area my uncle had always avoided when walking the property. I remembered him once telling me, casually, never to dig there without asking questions first. At the time, I thought it was superstition. Now it felt like instruction. I requested public records myself. Environmental filings. Historical land use. State archives. Most of it was mundane until I reached a sealed reference tied to an old federal remediation project from decades earlier. The language was vague, technical, and heavily summarized, but one phrase stood out. Restricted survey zone pending further classification. No explanation. No closure date. That explained the suits. The HOA president didn't know any of this when she called the land worthless. She saw empty acreage and assumed neglect equaled value. She wasn't alone. Most people equate worth with visibility. Roads, houses, structures. If it doesn't show, it doesn't count. My uncle had relied on that assumption for years. A week later, I received a call from a state environmental officer. Polite. Measured. He asked if I'd authorized any excavation. I said no. He sounded relieved. He explained that initial surveys suggested the presence of legacy materials buried deep below the surface. Not exposed, not active, but sensitive enough to require oversight. He couldn't say more until testing was complete. I asked if I was in danger. He said no, not if the land remained undisturbed. That single sentence reframed everything. The land wasn't hazardous because it existed. It was hazardous if mishandled. That distinction mattered. It meant responsibility. It meant leverage. It meant anyone trying to force development would trigger consequences far beyond HOA authority. The HOA board requested a meeting 2 days later. Not by email, by certified letter. The tone was completely different now. Formal. Careful. They wanted to discuss shared concerns and clarify jurisdictional responsibilities. I agreed to attend, but I brought nothing with me except the deed and my notes. They sat across from me like people who had realized too late they'd misjudged the terrain. No accusations. No dismissive language. Just questions. What did I know?
Who had contacted me?
Was I planning to sell?
Develop?
I answered truthfully and minimally. I didn't speculate. I didn't educate them. The HOA president barely spoke. When she did, it was to ask whether the land posed a risk to the community. The question wasn't about value anymore. It was about exposure, liability,
Proximity.
I told her what the officer told me. Undisturbed land posed no threat. Mishandling did. Silence followed that. They ended the meeting quickly. No demands. No suggestions. Just a vague statement about awaiting further guidance. As I left, I realized the balance had shifted completely. They no longer viewed the land as empty. They viewed it as something they didn't control and didn't fully understand. Back on the property, the flags still fluttered in the wind. Nothing dramatic had changed on the surface. No alarms. No fences. Just space. But beneath it lay history, decisions made long before the HOA existed, now resurfacing through caution and procedure. My uncle had known. He hadn't hidden the land out of neglect. He'd protected it through stillness. And by inheriting it, I'd inherited not just acreage, but the responsibility of knowing when not to touch what others were too eager to exploit. The HOA had called it worthless because they thought worth meant immediate use. They were wrong. Some land is valuable precisely because disturbing it changes everything. The official report arrived 3 weeks later in a plain envelope with no return branding, just a tracking number and a signature requirement. Inside were summaries, charts, and language that avoided drama while quietly confirming everything the Hazmat suits had implied. The land contained legacy industrial remnants buried deep beneath the surface, material left over from a discontinued federal operation decades earlier. It wasn't leaking. It wasn't spreading. But it was classified, monitored, and protected under overlapping state and federal statutes. In simple terms, the land couldn't be disturbed without triggering mandatory oversight. That changed the definition of worthless instantly. The report explained that any excavation, grading, or development would require environmental clearance, federal notification, and continuous monitoring. Violations carried penalties severe enough to halt projects indefinitely. The land itself wasn't toxic. It was sensitive. And sensitivity meant control shifted upward, far beyond the reach of an HOA handbook. I didn't share the report right away. Not out of spite, but because there was no obligation to. Ownership didn't require disclosure unless action was taken. Silence, once again, was the safest option. The land had existed this way for decades without incident. It didn't need explanation to justify its existence. The HOA didn't stay silent. They sent a proposal, carefully worded. They suggested purchasing an easement across a small portion of the acreage to improve community access and safety. The price was generous compared to their earlier dismissal, but still based on the assumption that the land's value came from convenience, not consequence. I declined. That refusal triggered a different response. The HOA consulted outside counsel. I knew because their questions changed. They stopped asking what I planned to do and started asking what I knew. They requested copies of surveys. I declined again. Politely. Ownership gave me that right. Then the police returned. This time without hazmat suits, but with state officials and unmarked vehicles. They walked the perimeter, confirmed the flags, and posted temporary notices warning against unauthorized disturbance. No fences. Just language. Legal language. The kind that doesn't invite debate. Neighbors noticed immediately. Speculation spread faster than facts. Some thought it was contamination. Others whispered about buried waste, old weapons, forgotten disasters. None of it mattered. What mattered was perception. The same land once mocked as empty was now treated like something fragile and dangerous. People avoided it. Developers stopped calling. The HOA stopped mentioning resale value entirely. The board requested another meeting. This time, they came prepared. Attorneys. Consultants. A thick binder filled with hypotheticals. They wanted assurances. That the land wouldn't impact them. That no future action would reduce property values. That liability wouldn't spill outward. They were no longer interested in control. They wanted insulation. I told them the truth. As long as the land remained undisturbed, nothing would change. No risk. No exposure. But if anyone attempted to force development, rezone without clearance, or interfere with monitoring protocols, the response would not be administrative. It would be regulatory. Federal. That word ended the conversation. The HOA president didn't argue. She didn't scoff. She stared at the table, hands folded tightly, understanding finally settling in. Her earlier confidence had been built on the assumption that authority flowed downward. She now realized it didn't. It flowed to whoever held jurisdiction. And jurisdiction wasn't hers. Within a month, the HOA quietly amended its development plans. Roads were rerouted. Expansion zones adjusted. Language about unused land disappeared from future proposals. They stopped pretending the acreage didn't exist and started planning around it instead. I walked the land again one evening alone. Nothing had changed physically. The grass moved with the wind. The soil sat undisturbed. But the meaning had shifted completely. What lay beneath wasn't dangerous by nature. It was dangerous to ignorance. Dangerous to people who saw land only as something to consume. My uncle had understood that long before anyone else cared. He didn't leave me 600 acres to build on. He left me 600 acres to leave alone. And in doing so, he handed me leverage no HOA, no developer, and no shallow assessment could ever take away. The land didn't need to prove its worth. It had already done that by forcing everyone else to slow down, suit up, and finally admit they didn't know what they were standing on. The fallout didn't come loudly. There were no emergency meetings announced to residents, no public statements, no explanations pinned to bulletin boards. Everything happened quietly, in revisions, omissions, and sudden restraint. The HOA didn't apologize. They didn't need to. Their behavior said enough. I noticed it first in the paperwork. Proposed zoning changes that had been circulating for months were withdrawn without comment. Infrastructure maps were updated, lines bending subtly away from my boundary. Language like future development corridor vanished from documents where it had once been bold and confident. The land was no longer described at all. It had become a blank space everyone agreed not to fill in. The HOA president avoided me entirely. Where she once inserted herself into every conversation, she now delegated everything involving my property to legal counsel. Even casual encounters stopped. If she saw me near the gate or along the road, she'd turn away, phone suddenly urgent, expression closed. The shift wasn't personal. It was defensive. She understood now that attention brought risk. State officials continued periodic monitoring, always scheduled, always procedural. No hazmat suits this time, but the presence alone carried weight.
Clipboards.
GPS units. Measured steps. They never entered deeply. They didn't need to. The protocols were already in place, written long before I inherited anything. The land simply reminded people those protocols existed. A developer tried once. He contacted me directly, bypassing the HOA, offering what he called a creative solution. Conservation offsets. Phased development. Minimal disturbance. I forwarded the message to the environmental officer who'd first called me. The reply came back short and unmistakable. Any disturbance would trigger a full federal review.
Years.
Millions. Uncertainty. The developer never replied again. That was when the narrative fully inverted. The land wasn't worthless because nothing could be done with it. It was valuable because so much couldn't. It functioned as a boundary no one could push without consequence. A natural stop sign embedded in policy and history. The HOA hadn't lost control because of me. They'd never had it to begin with. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended quietly, the agenda skipped over future expansion entirely. The focus was maintenance, compliance, and budget stabilization. Smaller concerns. Safer ones. When a resident asked about long-term growth plans, the board responded vaguely, citing external constraints. No one pressed. Everyone understood what that meant. Afterward, one board member approached me privately. Not confrontational. Not defensive. Just curious. He asked if I'd always known. I told him the truth. I hadn't. I'd inherited land, not insight. The knowledge came later, revealed slowly, because I hadn't rushed to change anything. He nodded, thoughtful, and said something that stuck with me. Most people lose power because they try to use it too fast. My uncle had never tried to use it at all. As months passed, the flags were eventually removed. Notices replaced them, permanent and understated. No drama. Just warnings phrased in legal language that discouraged curiosity. The land faded back into the background visually, but its presence loomed larger than before. People didn't look at it anymore. They respected it by not asking. The HOA president's influence continued to erode. Not because of scandal, but because credibility depends on judgment. Hers had been exposed as shallow. She'd evaluated worth based on convenience and aesthetics, and the miscalculation lingered. When she spoke now, others listened less. Authority, once cracked, doesn't reseal easily. I realized then that the real shift hadn't been regulatory. It had been psychological. The HOA no longer assumed it understood everything within its borders. That confidence was gone. In its place was caution. And caution, when forced upon people used to control, is transformative. The land remained unchanged, exactly as my uncle had kept it. Untouched. Quiet. Patient. It didn't need fences or signs to assert itself. It had already done what it was meant to do: expose the limits of authority, slow down arrogance, and remind everyone that not everything exists to be optimized. Sometimes, the most powerful inheritance isn't what you can build. It's what you know better than to disturb. The final realization settled in gradually, not through any single event, but through the absence of conflict. Weeks passed without letters, calls, or thinly veiled suggestions about improving the land. The HOA learned to coexist with something it couldn't redefine, and in doing so, it quietly changed how it operated everywhere else. Rules were still enforced, but with hesitation. Enforcement notices became requests. Deadlines softened into discussions. The board, once eager to assert control, now double-checked authority before acting. The land had done that, without lawsuits, without confrontation, by simply existing as something they could not rush, reshape, or dominate. I walked the acreage one last time before winter set in, following the same paths my uncle once did. The ground was firm, undisturbed, exactly as it should be. Nothing about it looked special. That was the point. Its power was invisible. It lived in the restrictions, the protocols, the silence it demanded from people who preferred noise and certainty. The HOA president resigned 3 months later. The announcement cited personal reasons and thanked her for years of service. No one clapped. No one asked questions. Her departure felt inevitable, like gravity finally asserting itself. Leadership built on shallow judgment rarely survives exposure. A new board took over with a noticeably different tone. They spoke less about expansion and more about stewardship, less about potential and more about limits. The word worthless never appeared again in reference to land, people, or ideas. Experience had cured them of that habit. For me, the inheritance became clearer with time. My uncle hadn't left me 600 acres to profit from or develop. He left me 600 acres to protect by doing nothing. He understood something most people don't. Restraint can be a form of control more effective than action. Had I rushed to dig, build, or sell, everything would have collapsed into chaos. Lawsuits, investigations, permanent damage. Instead, patience revealed value that aggression never could. The land taught everyone around it how small their authority really was. Occasionally, neighbors still ask what's under there. I give the same answer every time. Nothing you need to worry about. And that's true. The danger was never the soil. It was the impulse to treat everything as usable, sellable, conquerable. The police never returned in hazmat suits again. They didn't need to. Their first visit accomplished what years of warnings couldn't. It reset expectations. It reminded people that some systems outrank HOAs, some histories outrank plans, and some land outranks ambition. Standing at the gate now, looking across the quiet acres, I understand why my uncle never explained himself. Explanation invites argument. Silence invites caution. He trusted the land to speak when it needed to, and when it did, everyone listened. The HOA called it worthless because they measured worth by immediate return. They were wrong. True value doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, buried, until someone impatient enough tries to claim it without understanding the cost. Nothing dramatic remains. No flags. No officers. No meetings about my property. Just space, wind, and time doing exactly what they've always done. And that's the ending most people miss. The victory wasn't proving the land was dangerous. It wasn't humiliating the HOA. It wasn't leverage or money or headlines. The victory was forcing everyone to slow down, to recognize limits, to respect what they didn't own, to understand that some inheritances aren't meant to be exploited. They're meant to be left alone. 600 acres of quiet taught an entire community that lesson. And it will keep teaching it long after everyone involved has moved on.